Welcome into the next installment of the CFF Sites preseason preview series. My name is Joe DeSalvo, and I am joined once again by my partner, Mike. Mike, we're into the Mountain West Conference today. Our West Coast swing, if you will. We're going to tackle the Mountain West Conference today before we get into the Pac-12. So we're going to head out west for the next two episodes. As always, go team by team. You know, when I was looking through some of the notes before, they've got some changes going on in the Mountain West Conference, up and down. So we're going to get into quite a bit on this show. A lot to talk about, a lot of turnover, particularly, even schools at Utah State Conference Championship, new look for the wide receiver core. So a lot to get into.
Yeah. And except for the teams that we're going to start with here, because it's tough to come up with a lot of talking points with some of these teams.
Well, jokingly, you had sent the note on me to me the other day and said, I can't wait to hear about your New Mexico take. So
you prepared something, didn't you?
So let's get into it, man, because, that's probably going to be the one team we're going to run right through, right? I mean, they had Miles Kendrick from Kansas at quarterback, Porter, the receiver from Arizona State. Trace Buckler, I think is his name, Buckler, probably the most relevant name maybe for fantasy purposes early on if you're in some huge league for tight ends, right? But not much to talk about here with New Mexico. Probably be in and out really quick.
Yeah. At 12 points a game last year, by far the lowest in all of FBS. Wouldn't be surprised if it's the same again, because you're trotting out Miles Kendrick at quarterback. Couldn't win the job at Kansas when Kansas under the previous staff. So obviously not a ton to look at there. I thought running back was maybe a little interesting. Nathaniel Jones is back on the roster, was one of their highest rated recruits in all of program history. So he should start. But outside of that, I think anytime a wide receiver converts to tight end or is now listed as a tight end, that always kind of gets my attention, just because, those types of athletic options at tight end typically are good. If you're making the transition from receiver to tight end, you're typically, a pretty athletic option. So Trace Buckler might get some interest there. I don't think the system produces a ton of tight end production. Obviously, when you're averaging 12 points a game, there's not a ton of interest here. So I think Nathaniel Jones, Trace Buckler, kind of the two, outside shots at maybe fantasy relevancy.
Yeah, like you said, this was the worst offense in all of FBS last year. And so ways to go. We're really not paying much attention here, but we're equal opportunists. So we've got to give them at least some airtime. But let's go over to UNLV, where Charles Williams, the running back, is now gone. Under Marcus Arroyo, he has a history of producing some 1,000-yard rushers. There's a little bit of uncertainty right now. We've got a bevy of running backs right now that can start in that UNLV backfield. I know early on we were looking at Javon Wilson, the transfer. I think he came over from Oregon. We settled a little bit, with Chad Mayar, the guy that's been in the program, but really there are a couple of other names to watch out for too. Courtney Reese, Sammy Green, the freshman you had mentioned in the conference write-up piece. You had sort of referenced all those names. Really nothing set in stone right now at that running back spot with that UNLV offense as we go into preseason camp.
No, and that's typically the focus, as you mentioned, under Arroyo. A name that I actually saw that we didn't list in the guide that I saw elsewhere is Aiden Robbins, a Louisville transfer. Again, I didn't know this until a week or two ago that he's still there, or he transferred there during the off season. So we got a number of names to look out for, and I don't think there's a pecking order at this point. I was doing some research earlier today on Arroyo, and I found an interesting stat. Over the last 4 years, his running back one has produced 46% of the volume share over the last 4 years. That's seventh highest in the country at 48%. So typically, the running back one here is the guy to own, and we saw that obviously the last few years with Charles Williams. And a guy like Chad Magyar or even Aiden Robbins, they fit that size profile that you're kind of look for in an Arroyo offense, like plus pounds. So, our focus is in the backfield this offseason.
Well, and I think, to your point though, that's exactly what we're talking about. I mean, Williams was basically a 3-year starter though, right? And so the concern is whether or not they really have that guy that they're going to be leaning on. And UNLV, I'm not anticipating them to be very good in that conference. Maybe not the worst team in the conference, but you don't even expect them to be in the middle of the pack this year. So the running back spot under Arroyo is where we have our eyes. They do have a couple of playmakers on the outside, but for fantasy purposes, we're looking at that running back spot as the year progresses.
Yeah. I think they're trending towards the kind of middle of the pack, potentially in the Mountain West. I mean, Arroyo's recruiting pretty well, both, in the portal and true freshmen. So, I think a good season is if they finish middle of the pack in the Mountain West.
One program they're definitely trending better than right now, I would like to say, would probably be Nevada, who took a huge hit when Jay Norvell left town and took basically half of what seemingly was half of the talent on the roster to join him at Colorado State. There's not a lot there in regards to that passing game that still remains, Mike. Heavy turnover at Nevada. The running backs are back. That might be the strength of the offense this year with Toa in the backfield and Devonta Lee as well. From that passing game, though, it's going to be a big difference from what we saw a year ago, though, right?
Yeah, it's a complete stay away in the passing game for me. They don't have the weapons at receiver right now. Yeah, it was weird that people were tabbing Nate Cox as the projected quarterback one there. In my opinion, for those that watched that bowl game, he was dreadful. I know he didn't have his weapons, but he was dreadful against Western Michigan in that bowl game. So I expect Shane Illingworth, the Oklahoma State transfer, to start at quarterback now. Again, like I said, he doesn't have a ton of weapons there. They've all shipped out to Colorado State. I think the one where you mentioned the running backs, their offensive line, I don't think is going to be that good this year. Tight end is potentially a long shot here because their new offensive coordinator comes over from UCLA. He was their tight end position coach, and we know from UCLA, I know it's Chip Kelly's system, but nobody produced better tight end production in the country really than UCLA in that system. So maybe a guy like I think his name is Cooper Schultz, Oregon transfer. Maybe that's somebody to look out for on waivers. But yeah, this is a year zero year for Nevada.
Well, whichever way those three, the programs that we just mentioned, New Mexico, UNLV, Nevada, are trending from a fantasy relevancy standpoint, probably the three teams that are more stay away than the ones that we're going to get into moving forward. We'll move right into Wyoming because much like where we were focused on the running back spot at UNLV, that's a position that you want to focus on over at Wyoming, whereas Xavier Valladay left for Arizona State. Titus Fenn there, we're assuming is going to step right into that running back one role traditionally in that offense. And I know there might be some slight changes, but, they like to feed their running back one up at Wyoming right now. They lost Isaiah Nair to Texas transfer, but he was an outlier in that offense. I mean, I think he had more touchdowns last year than maybe the whole receiving corps had like in 3 years combined, right? So really, it's all about Wyoming and that running back one spot in that offense, right?
Yeah, Titus Swen is an interesting case for me, and I think probably others this year, in that you get around, if not more than 500 total team carries from Wyoming almost every year. I know it's been the last 3 years. And you take Xavier Valladay out of that equation. I think they're somewhat confident in their RB2, but he's not a proven commodity. So you take Valladay out of the equation, and then you take Levi Williams out of the equation, who obviously can run the ball quite a bit. And where are these carries going? I know Andrew Peasley, the projected starter now, can move a little bit, but he's not the runner that Levi Williams was. So where are the 500 carries going? You could potentially see a 300 carry season from Titus Swen. I think that would be, that's the greatest possible outcome there. Right. Probably not likely, but I think 250 carries is well within range of the workload that Titus Swen could could see this year.
Yeah, and I think certainly that's his ceiling. And, you know, if we're ready to move on and we talk about 500 carries as a team, right, it's hard to ignore Air Force, where, 500 carries for a season is probably their floor. But, an interesting conversation we can get into is Brad Roberts, who had a huge year last year. He carried the ball nearly 300 times in that Falcons backfield, which was unusually high for a Falcons running back. A little bit of regression this year for Roberts, you think, numbers wise?
Yeah, that the amount of carries that he had last year was an extreme outlier from what we see from the fullbacks, B-backs, whatever you want to call them at Air Force. And it's not only an outlier, but I think you also kind of saw the depth that Air Force has in that backfield. Heading into this year, DeAndre Hughes had a big game late in the year. The backup fullback Emmanuel Michel had a big game. So they've got options in that backfield where I don't think we're going to see close to 300 carries again from Brad Roberts. So not a guy that I am really prioritizing. I think the Air Force offense could be the best that it's been in years. But yeah, Brad Roberts just doesn't excite me as much as he did last year.
No, he doesn't, but you could do worse, right? And from a consistency standpoint, depending on the depth of your league, solid running back 2, maybe flex option week to week, right? So, where we're expecting a little regression possibly in his numbers still, we're not trying to talk anybody off the ledge on Brad Roberts, still a solid pick college fantasy purposes, because we know that he's going to at least get fed the ball, as long as he's in the lineup, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And their offensive line, like the production that they had last year, they were replacing all 5 starters. Not unusual for the academies, but they're replacing all 5 starters. And now they get 3 back this year. So I think the running game could be just as good, if not better.
Now we're going to transition to a program that maybe isn't so much about the running game this year, but it's interesting, Mike, because we just mentioned Jay Norvell when we were talking about Nevada, kind of takes his bags, takes his players and some of his roster, even coaches as well, over to Colorado State, where he inherits at least a decent roster too. It's not like Dante Wright is still there. They bring over Melquan Stovall, Torrey Horton from Nevada, Clay Millen at quarterback. There's a lot there that they can work with this year, but this was something you and I talked about. Are we going to be able to project the instant success at Colorado State and just think that Nevada offense, from the points that they put up last year, is that going to be what to expect from Colorado State? You and I both emphatically disagree with that, right? It's going to take a little time. It may not be the floor from when Norvell took over from his early days at Nevada, but I think it's going to be a little time before we see the Rams offense get cranking.
Yeah, it's tough, right? Because we, to an extent, made that same argument last year with Western Kentucky, and look what happened. And it's not the same situation, but it's similar in the sense that they're bringing over, multiple offensive linemen, multiple receivers, the quarterback. So they're bringing over via the portal a lot of guys that are familiar with this offensive system. So the transition, you would think, would be smoother than most. But I looked back at that first year that Norvell was at Nevada, and there's a noticeable difference, obviously, between the last year that he showed up. They averaged top 50 in pace the last 4 of the 5 years that Norvell was at Nevada. They were 92nd that first year, so definitely slower that first season. They averaged, I think, a touchdown less points per game than they did in the final season. Again, to be expected, but just some differences between the last year at Nevada and his first year. So a transition, yes. Will it be as productive as it will next year? Not likely, but I think since a lot of the core pieces are familiar with Norvell, that it could be a smoother transition than anticipated.
Smoother transition, yes, but I'm the one that's going to predict that we're not going to. I mean, look, you've got to realize they lost some guys. He had NFL talent on that roster last year, and so that's what I'm looking at. And I'm not saying that that roster is devoid of talent this year, Mike, but I'm not ready to make that. Hey, look what happened with Western Kentucky last year. I'm not ready to make that jump. I do think in some of our drafts that we've had so far to date that some of the Colorado State players, maybe even Clay Millen himself at quarterback, I'm just, for me, the value isn't there. I feel like they're just going a little too early for my liking, where I like to, from a value standpoint for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of the same. It's I don't think I'm missing out on like a Western Kentucky or anything by not drafting them. I will say the one guy that does intrigue me most from a redraft standpoint is probably Torrey Horton. Yes. 4 out of the last 5 years, outside receiver under Norvell is typically wide receiver 1. I don't know. People talk up Malcolm Stovall just because of kind of the spring game that he had, but he had 1 touchdown, I think, in his career at Nevada. Might be a solid PPR option, full point.
Yeah.
But not a guy that I'm reaching out and grabbing just because of his spring.
Well, I do think we could spend at least a couple of more minutes on Colorado State because you do have Dante Wright back, right? So there might be some people looking at Dante Wright, seeing what he's done over the last couple of years. There's some talent there. You and I are in agreement. We do like Horton a little bit better right now. Wright may be wide receiver 3 at best in that offense right now, right?
Yeah.
And there's some question about tight end too, because Norvell has been able to produce, particularly last year at the tight end spot. Right now we're at Tanner Arkin, but tight end, but that possibly could go a couple of different ways as well too, right?
Yeah, we don't know it was one beat writer that posted a post-spring depth chart, and that's kind of where everybody's getting their opinions on Colorado State, right? Dante Wright, not even a starter. Tanner Arkin over. Gary Williams at tight end. Gary Williams, I don't think played, or at least it was limited in spring. So that's kind of why Arkin is listed as the tight end 1. But we have Arkin projected as the tight end 1. Who's to say there's not a split between the two in him and Gary Williams. So guys, and again, this is definitely a team that you want to pay attention to this year and beyond.
Well, another team in transition as well, so we're going to get right into them, Hawaii, where Timmy Chang takes over the program. Interesting, he brings in Ian Shoemaker from Eastern Washington, right? So you've got a hybrid offense here that we're looking at Hawaii, installing this year. Uncertainty about quarterback right now. We know they brought in Cameron Cooper. Joey Yellen transferred over from Pitt. Braden Shager right now. Shager is probably our projected starter coming out of spring right now. When you've got a program like this in transition, you've got Dedrick Parson at running back, Zion Bowens at probably the 2 known commodities in most college fantasy football drafts, at least for us up until right now. But there's still a lot to unpack with this Hawaii offense, probably throughout the summer and preseason camp too. We're going to find out a lot about them early on in the year, and it may not be until a couple of games into the year until we figure out a few more pieces of this puzzle.
Yeah, maybe a few more years. This is different than Colorado State to me in the sense that down the road, we're going to want to invest in this offense, right? I mean, the offensive coordinator previously of Eastern Washington, previously of Central Washington too, in the last 5 years, and just from a fantasy point per game basis when talking about their quarterbacks, the offensive coordinator, Ian Shoemaker, would have produced top 20 quarterbacks from a fantasy point per game perspective in each of the last 5 seasons.
Yep.
So this is a high-flying offensive attack. It's just a matter of, do they have the pieces to make it work this year? I don't think they do at this point. It's tough to find a ton of information on Hawaii, but just from a roster talent standpoint, I don't think they have that this year, particularly at quarterback. As you mentioned, the 2 that we're really focused on is Dedrick Parsons and Zion Bowens, because Parson, proven commodity to an extent, 8 rushing touchdowns last year. He had a big game against New Mexico State with 161 rushing yards. And then Bowens, a guy that, I kind of tweeted about it. This is a guy that I've nabbed in almost every draft just because he keeps falling to me. I'm not reaching for it. It's just kind of value in my opinion. But it's interesting that people got hyped up over the spring game, and I'm gonna butcher the name, but it is Tamatoa Adamalalala. He caught multiple touchdowns in the spring game, but if you watch the highlights, if you watch the highlights from that game, I don't think he was working with the first team. And Bowens caught a long touchdown from Shakir in that game. So Bowens was the one that was working with the first team. So that's kind of why I'm more focused on Bowens here. And if they're going to be a high volume passing attack, you're going to want at least one wide receiver in this offense.
Yep, that's a good point. Well, look, let's hop over to San Diego State, where the passing game isn't much topic of conversation, where it's the running game. But Greg Bell has moved on. A lot of questions, a lot of talk between you and I, Chance Bell, Jordan Byrd, Jalen Armstead, the bevy of running backs there. And then all of a sudden, just a few weeks ago, boom, we get the news that Keenan Christon is transferring, former USC running back. He's now in the fold. Maybe the most talented of the bunch. You would think he might have a chance to maybe slide into that running back one spot. But like you said, as we've done with a lot of these programs, we've still got preseason camp to go, a long way to go before we really know for sure. But we do know that running back one spot in that San Diego State offense is definitely a position you want under the microscope, or at least on your watch list for college fantasy football purposes.
Yeah, this is the second time in the last 12 years that the Aztecs are not returning a 1,000-yard rusher. So obviously, this is a ground and pound attack. We want to invest in the running game. It's just a matter of who. Keenan Christon, we instituted him as the running back one immediately once he transferred there, just because, kind of read the tea leaves coming out of spring reports with San Diego State that just nobody asserted themselves between those three options already on the roster as like a guy that might take over that job. So we put Christon as one for now. Yeah. But I don't think it's settled. I found an interesting stat actually on Chance Bell from Mount Westwire. I'll read it for you. 33 carries 33 runs for Chance Bell of at least 10 yards or more in his career. That's 12.8% of his carries. That's more than Greg Bell had, and that's more than Juwan Washington had. So Chance Bell has been productive in his career. So I think we would agree that while we have Christon one, I think this is going to be a spot to watch in the summer, and maybe Chance Bell assumes to that one role as well.
Well, you bring up an interesting point, an interesting stat on Chance Bell, but and this is why the hesitation with him. Usually, when you've got the next guy, the next man up, it's pretty clear cut. The buzz and the noise coming out in and around camp and around the program, and that just hasn't been the case with San Diego State this offseason.
Yeah, 100% correct. I mean, they got a veteran in Chance Bell who's been with the program, and then they have Jalen Armstead, a sophomore. So, you got the depth there, yet they're bringing in somebody else in that backfield. So, again, a lot of our research, I feel like, is reading the tea leaves, and that's one of those that just kind of points to Christon taking over that.
Now, one thing could help a little bit, Braxton Burmeister coming in at quarterback. You feel like it's an upgrade for them at quarterback. Any interest on Burmeister late in drafts, deep leagues from a fantasy perspective?
No. Of course, the only time a San Diego State quarterback had any success last year was when I bet they're under in a prop. So I'm staying away. Braxton Burmeister, tempting from a running standpoint, right? Yep. Really good athlete, but he doesn't bring anything to the table.
Probably a name we'll get into as the season progresses with DFS, not so much for season long.
Absolutely.
Now let's scoot over to San Jose State, Mike, where Elijah Cooks and Justin Lockhart both transfer from Nevada, land at San Jose State, where the offense has sort of been rebuilt. They bring in Chevin Cordero at quarterback. So 2 new weapons and a new quarterback at San Jose State. Those really are the 3 top names on our list right now in the preseason. You know, they've got, is it Kyrie Robinson coming back at running back? But for me, the eyes are more on the passing game and what could be this year on a new look Spartans offense.
Yeah, we don't have any interest in Kyrie Robinson or that backfield for the most part. They haven't had a guy finish in the top 100 of fantasy running backs in the last 4 to 5 seasons. So not a ton of interest there. It's with the passing game. And I wouldn't call this an air raid offense, but I think they're 16th over the last 3 years in passing volume. So they chuck it quite a bit. And, you know, we kind of projected this season when compiling our projections to 2019, when it was like Josh Love and Trey Walker and Bailey Gaither. Just, we see similarities with this, with the pieces that they brought in from the transfer portal. So I'm excited to watch this passing offense with Cordero and Lockhart and Elijah Cooks, pending he stay healthy. So yeah, that's our focus there.
Well, 2018, they had 2 700-yard receivers. In 2019, they had an 1,100-yard, 800-yard receiver. So we're seeing, you know, not that they're going to get to those numbers, but we can see them trending a little bit closer to those numbers than they were last year, where Derek Deese, the tight end, finished the year as their leading receiver, right?
Yeah. And coincidentally, you bring up the tight end. I wanted to mention one of my sleepers. I think I texted you this back in like February. I'm in on Sam Olsen as a tight end one, not saying he's going to put up numbers similar to Derek Deese, but you know, he had a 70-yard touchdown reception week 1 last year before he got injured against Southern Utah. And he's 6'4", a lot of speed. He was pulling away from some defenders, and the defensive back really, who was chasing him down, didn't really gain a ton of ground there. So he's a guy that we project to have a pretty good season.
Yep. Now let's go over to Fresno State, where they get Jake Haener and Jalen Cropper back. That's great for the passing game. Jordan Mims comes in, takes over at running back. I don't think they're losing much at running back, even though Ronnie Rivers has moved on. Mims was proven just as effective, if not more effective, when he played in Rivers' absence, when he was hurt and in the final game last year. Expectations from the Fresno State offense this year, given the coaching change, are we going to see maybe a little bit of a slower pace this year, Mike?
I don't think so, because of his retaining of Kirby Moore, I believe his name is, at offensive coordinator. Who was the passing game coordinator, offensive coordinator under Kalen DeBoer last year. So I would assume that Tedford kind of just wants to keep the wheel turning, because there's really not a ton to fix with Fresno State at this point. So I think it's kind of just, kind of similar story to last year, right?
Yeah, I think so. You know, the one thing with to try to keep continuity the best as possible, you've got to realize, I think there had to be some things said in order to keep guys like Haener and Cropper, have Haener come back another year. I think there had to be some talking to say, hey, look, we're not going to change much. We're going to try to keep things as much as possible. But what's interesting is that, with that being said, I find that those guys actually are going lower in drafts this year than they were a season ago. Were we just too high on them last year? Or are we undervaluing them a little bit this year? Or is it a little bit of both?
Maybe a little bit of both. I think, and it's something that we talk about a lot, is that they're seniors. Right? People don't get excited to draft these guys, regardless of how productive they are. And I think that speaks to the point of, we always talk about later in drafts, we want to draft upside, right? You know what you're going to get from Jordan Mims. You know what you're going to get from Jake Haener. I'm a little higher, I think, than most on Jalen Cropper. I think the move to outside receiver that he made in the spring, I think that'll help his ADOT and his yards per catch average. But again, these guys have been around. You just know what to expect. You're not going to get, I don't think these guys are going to be, running back one, quarterback one. That's just not how Fresno State operates. So I think that's why you're seeing them potentially fall in drafts a little bit.
Now let's go over to Utah State, where the Aggies took Mountain West Conference by storm last year, won the conference title. Logan Bonner back at quarterback for Blake Anderson, but there's some turnover at receiver, a lot of turnover, right? They lose Deven Thompkins, who basically caught 650 balls last year, right? So they get Justin McGriff back, who was one of their top 4 receivers last year, but there's some turnover and there's some names, right? You got Brian Cobbs, the transfer that came in from Maryland. You've got Nine Davis, who we were reading his name all throughout spring practice. You still have Xavier Williams there, the transfer from Alabama, who really has yet to do anything on the field, but we know he's got at least some, talent behind his name and potential, right? So there's still a little bit to be learned about this Utah State offense, but those are sort of the names that we're talking about, leading up to the 2022 season right now, that we need to see how some things shake out, because this Utah State offense has potential to produce 3 at least decent options in the passing game at receiver, right?
Yeah, 2 relevant receivers is safe. And as we saw last year, I think you could have 3, right? With Bowling and Deven Thompkins and Derek Wright was the 3rd option. So maybe we see that this year, right? We don't know yet. Could they're typically under Blake Anderson, you're like last 4 years, the wide receiver one has gotten 100 targets, right? Maybe they're dispersed a little bit between the top 3, top 4 this year if they like their depth. The point that I wanted to get across with Utah State is while we still have Brian Cobbs as the projected wide receiver 1, I'm baiting him and drafting Justin McGriff instead, right? Because we don't know for sure who that guy is going to be at this point. And I just got Justin McGriff 10 rounds later than Brian Cobbs. So I think Justin McGriff is the value at this point. I would not be reaching for Brian Cobbs, despite our projection. I would not be reaching for Brian Cobbs in the 5th or 6th round because of there's that uncertainty there.
Yeah, if you're drafting Cobbs, you're drafting upside, trying to get closer to those Deven Thompkins numbers from numbers from last year. Whether or not McGriff can get there, probably not. But you're looking at a receiver that was one of their top 4 last year, probably going to be safely within the top 3, maybe 2 receivers this year. So from a value standpoint, it makes a lot of sense if you're not expecting the world. But I'm going to give you a hard time about this one, because it seems like you've adopted my approach and said it's a different year, because last year you were telling me, I'm not touching Justin McGriff. The dude cannot catch a cold. He's terrible.
I was not.
Did you go my route and just say, listen, that was last year, this is a new year?
No, I'll explain my reason. Like I watched him and I don't get overly excited. I thought he was kind of, long strider. Like he's not, I don't know. I didn't get too excited, pumped up watching him. But like, am I a pro scout? No. So you gotta kind of put that aside and be like, I don't know, I don't know football as well as football coaches or anything like that. So I'm again going with the tea leaves. I think you're made a good point that Brian Cobbs and Justin McGriff are probably solid top 2 to 3 in this passing offense. So I don't think you're necessarily drafting a complete bust when you draft a Brian Cobbs or McGriff. I like the value at this point.
Yeah,
getting them in the late teens versus top 6 rounds.
And you may not be a scout or anything, but our boy Eric Froton I remember last year when he was talking about Chris Olave's smooth hips, and I just wanted to know what that translated to for college fantasy football purposes. So got to give him a shout.
You can talk to him about that later this summer.
So look, man, we got one program left in the Mountain West Conference, Boise State Broncos. Quarterback Hank Backmeyer returns, right? The offensive coordinator returns. George Holani, the running back this year, hopefully returns healthy. He missed the beginning of last year, was banged up, finished strong, went over 103 of the last 4, caught 9 passes over the last 4 games too. Stefan Cobbs probably taken over that role for Khalil Shakir in that wide receiver 1 spot. Where are we looking at Broncos, Mike, this year, 2022? Can we expect a little bit more from George Holani? Because the concern last year, even when he was healthy and went over 103 of the last 4, he still only had 1 touchdown last year. And Andrew Van Buren led Boise State with 9 touchdowns. And that's my only concern with him this year is, are they going to try to find another goal line back, or will Holani do it all this year?
Well, we know who you like based on that intro of Boise State, and your eyes lit up when talking about George Holani there.
Yeah, I mean, I like George Holani. I just took him in the latest best ball draft. I took him last year too. Like I said, he went over 103 of the last 4 last year. If he's healthy, and here's the other thing too, we talked about this in the spring too. There's not a lot of proven depth behind him this year now, right? There's, that backfield isn't as deep as it was a year ago. So I do like, if he's healthy, there's an opportunity to maybe have a big season, and it is Boise State, and it's going to be one of the better programs in the conference.
Yeah, I'm glad you at least said proven there, because Ashton Jeanty is I think he's one of my favorite prospects coming into your G5 prospects, who could end up, starting at some point, just because George Holani has been injury prone the last few years. So, I thought you saw the late surge from Holani because of how the offensive line started to play a little bit better second half of the season. They get 3 starters back, added a Washington State transfer. So I think you can see a solid season out of Holani, but pending he stay healthy. I do like the backup in Jeanty, the incoming freshman coming in. Clear path to a starting role next year, most likely. And, just looking back at Tim Plow, the offensive coordinator, and his utilization of running backs at UC Davis, and his previous starter at UC Davis, what was his name? Alonzo Gilliam or something like that. He had 45 receptions on 60-ish targets. Now, Ashton Jeanty, I know I'm getting straying away from Holani, but Jeanty was a running back / receiver down in Texas when he played high school football. So he is an exceptional pass catcher coming out of the backfield as well. So that's a guy that I will be targeting in dynasty drafts for next year, right? And a guy, if Holani gets injured like he has the last 2 years, that's somebody you might look for on the waivers as well.
Well, it kind of brings our conversation a little bit. It allows us to fill in the gaps a little bit. If we can just go back to the conversation we just had just a bit ago about San Diego State, right? And we don't really know. Even though Chance Bell has done some things with the carries that he's gotten, there's nothing out there that suggests here's the next guy in line, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've been a fan of Jeanty for a while. You told me about him early in the spring to keep eyes on him. And it feels, if Holani does well, stays healthy, he's going to have a solid year. But Jeanty seems to be that next guy in line where this could be smooth transition next year. We're talking about him just as much as we're talking about Holani this year. And we're going to have a little bit more of a crystal clear, it's going to be in our crystal ball that it seems like, hey, the torch has been passed and the baton, is going to Jeanty from Holani.
Yeah, and he'll get some work. I mean, you mentioned the guys that have those vultures that they had last year with Van Buren and oh boy, the other guy's escaping me.
Hideki, for Boise State last year.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Either way, I think Jeanty's ready right now to play at 200 pounds. So I mean, it's a solid 1-2, I think there, and those guys should get the bulk of the carries. Stefan Cobbs I wanted to hit on him before we close out. His ADP has crept up into that 4th, 5th round range, and I was surprised that it didn't start there earlier in the year, because where was Khalil Shakir ranked last year? Because we got so excited with him in this Tim Plow offense.
Yep.
We might have had him top 5 if I remember correctly last year, but so he's a guy that's kind of creeping up or has crept up in my rankings, just because who's the wide receiver 2?
Yeah.
Trell Caples, maybe the favorite, but those guys were in and out during the spring. So, I mean, I think 100 targets, barring Cobbs stays healthy, is a near lock at this point. So he's a guy I've been hitting on in like the 4th, 5th round.
Well, the other thing too, a lot of the drafts that we've been doing, there's been a lot of punting on quarterbacks late in our best ball drafts, and running back receivers go early. You're looking at a receiver right now that I've got in the 17 spot. You got 15. So there, those guys, considering the way that our drafts are unfolding, are going pretty early. And by the time fall gets here, preseason camp, we may see him creep a little bit closer into our top 12. We'll see how the news comes out, maybe even closer to top 10.
Yeah, this is I mean, when everything's clicking, this is an offensive system that can average 40 passing attempts per game. So,
well, Mike, this is going to do it for our first leg on our West Coast swing. That's going to take care of the Mountain West Conference, man. We got the Pac-12 up. We've got a few of these left to go. We're kind of down the stretch. We've got the Pac-12, Independence, SEC, Sun Belt. Only few to go. We'll probably get these done sometime within the next week or so. We've got the best ball draft that we're doing, our 3rd industry best ball draft hosted by the CFF site. Those results will be going in the preseason fantasy draft guide. You and I are working on some other pieces that we're going to be going into the guide. We'll have some more details on that in maybe the next show as things get a little bit more clear on more of a date in which we're going to get things published. And so stay tuned for that. But all the content's up on the site. That preseason fantasy draft guide, I think, Mike, is like 85 plus pages now. By the time we're done with it by the 4th of July, that thing may be over 100 pages long. Just an unreal preseason fantasy resource to get you ready for your college fantasy football season. And if you are just a college football fan in general, it's just nice to get some eyes on some college football information, particularly on the offensive side. And it's a great resource. So more to come, Mike. That's going to do it for the Mountain West. My name's Joe DeSalvo with the CFF site. For Mike Bainbridge, we'll see you guys next time.